I'm going to give you all of Tim Ferriss's podcasting secrets. Tim is easily one of the best podcasters in the entire world. He's one of the first few names that comes to mind when you think of podcasting in general, and he is an incredibly skilled interviewer. Every time he has a guest on, the conversation's always smooth, and he always pulls away some amazing information or stories from the guest, often that you've never heard before. And he recently went on a different podcast called My First Million, where he shared all of his secrets, tips, and tricks that goes into having an amazing podcast episode every time. But that interview was pretty long, so what we've done in this video is distilled it down to the key takeaways, the major points that you want to focus on, and the secrets that you want to steal to make your content way better. So these are Tim Ferriss's podcasting secrets. Let's get right into them. So Tim was asked right away, what goes into making an amazing beginning of a podcast episode? Because that is the most important part of the entire episode for both the guest, you, and the listener. It's super important for the guest because it sets the tone for how they're going to feel in the conversation, how it's going to flow, and also how much information or insights they're actually going to give to you. It's massive for the listener because they're deciding based on the beginning of the episode how long they're going to stick around for. If you give them a ton early on, they're very likely going to stick around for the entire episode, regardless of how long it is. So getting the beginning right is incredibly crucial and where most people fail. And his answer to this was really surprising. So his answer was, it's not the beginning of the podcast that's the most important part. It's before you even start recording.
Yeah, I mean, the most important 5 minutes are the conversation I have before I start recording with someone.
And so he calls this giving your guest an on-ramp, because oftentimes, whether it's a virtual interview or in person, people have a lot of other things going on in their life, and they're coming from those things into your world for this conversation. So by being deliberate and giving them an on-ramp, you can allow them to transition, get in the right state of mind, and tee them up for a successful conversation that will allow it to flow a lot smoother.
Okay, you need to give them an on-ramp if you can, to decompress a little bit from that experience.
And he'll do all these steps, even if it means the interview ends up being shorter. That's how important he stresses these things really are. And that blew me away because he gets some incredibly high profile people that will only give an hour. And he's stressed, even if it'll cut into that time, he'll still do this because it's that important. So the on-ramp steps are as follows. The first is to put the guest at ease. Let them know that it's your job to make them look as good as possible. And that's what you're going to do. Let them know that anything can be edited out. And if they ever want to pause or restart a story, they're more than welcome to do that.
My job is to make you look as good as possible. Every guest has final cut.
Mm-hmm. Tim also recommends mentioning that you're going to keep an eye out for things they may want removed after the fact. And the example that he gave was a child's name or anything else that's really sensitive. This shows your expertise, and it also shows that you're on the guest side, which is going to make them open up a lot more. After you've eased them into conversation mode, the next step is to tee them up for success. And to do this is real straightforward. Ask them this simple question. 6 months from now, if you look back on this podcast, what would make it an overwhelming success? What would make you look back on this and be super happy that you did this episode? Use this to outline a plan for success. Next, ask for their greatest hits. So what are the topics, the themes, or the stories that they share that really stick with people, that get the best kind of impact? After figuring out what the greatest hit is, then decide on a question to tee them up to tell that story the best way possible. And if you can't think of anything top of head, just ask them. And use this as early in the episode as possible. It sets the guest up to look fantastic early on, which is a big win. And it also increases the chances that listeners are going to stick around.
And I will lead with that for two reasons. First is that I'm starting with something that my audience is likely to resonate with. Right. Number two, I'm giving them a win. I'm giving them a win up front.
And the last on-ramp step is just telling the guest where you're likely going to start off. And he uses this tactic to make sure that he won't start the conversation off in a disastrous place. For example, if he found something online that's not actually true and that's what he was going to open with, you want to make sure to voice that now and get confirmation with them that that actually is real. So by telling them where you plan to start, they can confirm with you that it is a good place. And they're also thinking through already before you even start recording how they're going to answer that question, which is going to improve the quality of that.
Now I've planted that seed. Their brain's working on that while we're doing the housekeeping, while we're talking about everything else. And then we start, and it's usually pretty smooth.
So that's his whole on-ramp approach before you even start recording an episode. The next tips are actually about the content itself. So Tim recommends starting off very strong, and how he does this is by asking a question that he's very confident they've never been asked on a different podcast.
And I always ask, and like almost nobody asks this. It's such an easy layup. In a case where someone's been interviewed 1,000 times, I want to ask them a question that shows I've done an inordinate amount of research.
Especially for Tim, most of the guests that he gets on, they've been interviewed a ton. And so they kind of go into robot mode when it comes to answering these questions. So every episode ends up sounding pretty similar. So by doing this, he can really capture their attention, catch them off guard, and it gets them far deeper into the conversation. And the examples that he could give would be talking about like a really old professor they had, maybe a sport they played when they were like 12, something super niche specific, simply to capture their attention and to pique their interest, to get them off autopilot and really into this conversation itself.
Who was so-and-so?
Right.
Tell me about so-and-so. And they're like, huh, okay.
So between that and their proven greatest hits that you already established earlier, you're going to have a great start to the podcast every single time, which will have a massive impact in terms of retention on that episode, which only helps you in the long run. And the next tip that Tim gave was to create freely and be very curious. Many podcasters fall victim to simply creating for their audience or what they think their audience wants. And that's a very dangerous game to play. And the point that they made was that most people don't actually know what they want. And so if you're doing something that you don't love doing because you think the audience wants it, you essentially become owned by your audience, and you're likely to not love what you're doing in the long run, which will only hurt the quality of the content. It's only going to hurt you, and in the end, it actually hurts the audience as well. So he recommends strongly following your interests, your curiosities, even if you don't think it's going to be a massive success in terms of views and downloads. If it keeps you highly interested, it keeps you engaged in the show, and it keeps you doing this for a longer term, it's worth it.
People don't really know what they want or need, which includes you and me. For that reason, rather than playing the speculation game, follow your own interest.
So he mentioned that he gives some for the audience and then some for himself as a mix of the two, but he stresses to try to not overemphasize on creating for the audience. It's a trap that too many people fall into, and that's why they don't stick with it in the long run. And longevity is such an important part for podcasting. So great advice from someone who's created thousands of episodes. Follow your curiosities, even if you don't think it's going to be commercially successful. Another point that he didn't mention in this interview, but I've heard him say in the past, is he'll typically make an episode if he even thinks that 10% of his audience would like it. And chances are, if you're interested in it, there's an audience out there that also is. So if that can make for great content, it is worth putting the time into to keep you engaged and the audience on their toes as well. So those were Tim Ferriss's biggest podcasting secrets, and we covered all of this information 3 weeks ago in our email newsletter. So if you want to stay up to date with the latest things in podcasting and how you can grow your show and your income faster, make sure to subscribe to our free email newsletter. You can do so using the link in the description box down below. And if you are a podcaster who's looking to make money from their podcast, check out this video right here where I cover 10 different ways that podcasters, even with a small audience, can make big income. So go ahead and check that out. I'll see you over there. Peace.